Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on this lovely Thursday. My name is Emily Cantrell, your director at World Trade Center Seattle. Welcome to the second of 5 Can We Talk programs in 2021. Today we are focusing on closing the COVID-19 gender gap. This series is more than 3 years in the making, and we are so grateful for our partnership with the Port of Seattle, who is our presenting sponsor. So before you meet today's panelists, please welcome Dawn Hunter to the stage for some opening remarks. Dawn?
Thank you, Emily. As Emily stated, my name is Dawn Hunter. I'm the Director of Aviation Commercial Management for Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, operated by the Port of Seattle. It is my pleasure to be here with you this morning. The World Trade Center of Seattle is an innovative partnership between the Port of Seattle and business communities, international and regional. The organization focuses on fostering economic growth opportunities while enhancing the life of people in the Pacific Northwest. And as we all know, COVID-19 has had a dramatic global impact on all of us, how we interact, how we think, and how we work. And how appropriate that the Trade Center, in partnership with Port of Seattle, is having number 5, Can We Talk, specifically talking about COVID-19 and the gender gap. As we know, women are the primary caregivers for their families, their children, their parents, and in this environment have had a dramatic impact on how we work. And so I just welcome you and I thank you for having me here today. And I turn it over. Welcome to the Closing the COVID-19 Gender Gap, Can We Talk, series number 5. Emily?
Thank you, Dawn. And I had this huge intro written for you and I got distracted and I completely skipped over it. So for everyone who doesn't know Dawn, Dawn is Director of Aviation Commercial Management for the Port of Seattle. So if you like all of the new dining and retail options that you've seen at the airport, Dawn is the person to thank. Dawn and her team opened more than 20 restaurants and stores in 2019. And now there are more women and minority businesses operating at the airport than at any other time in its more than 70-year history. Dawn works tirelessly to advance the Port's policies and practices to be more inclusive. So Dawn, thank you very much for being here. I apologize that your intro came at the end of your opening remarks, but we really appreciate you being here.
No problem, thank you. And I just wanted to add, all my accomplishment is because of good leadership. So I thank our Port of Seattle Commissioner, our Executive Director, Steve Metrick, and mostly our Aviation Managing Director, Lance Little, who was very supportive and has commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So
thank you, Dawn. Well, and now it is time to get the conversation underway. So if you have not used AirMeet before, it's a very interactive platform. If you missed the networking from this morning, feel free to introduce yourself using the chat feature. Tell us where you're from, what you're looking forward to about today's conversation. We'll also have networking after the program as well. And throughout the program, you can use the reactions feature, which is at the bottom of your screen, or ask questions using the questions feature. You can upvote questions. So if someone asks something and you really want to know the answer to it, like it, and it'll help move that question to the top. And we plan on leaving questions for the last 15 minutes. By the way, we are live tweeting today. Thank you to our colleague, Steven, for helping us with that. So if you're on Twitter, please follow WTC Seattle and help us with that conversation. So to carry us through today's conversation about closing the COVID-19 gender gap, we have 3 incredible leaders with us. We have, in alphabetical order, Ryan Donahue, a non-resident fellow with Brookings. Welcome, Ryan. We have Bukta Kesar, Senior Director in the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at the Port of Seattle. Welcome, Bukta. And we have Banu Oskazengpan, Professor of Practice in Engineering and the founder and director of the Venture Capital Inclusion Lab at Brown University. Thank you all so much for being here today. Before we get deep into the conversation, let us start with a very quick lightning round. So this is going to be a question that you can answer in just a few words, 1 sentence max. If you could do one thing right now to help close the COVID-19 gender gap, what would it be? And Bon, please start us off.
Yeah, thank you, Emily, for inviting me and for being, a gracious host here. If I could do one thing, I would prioritize support and infrastructure that would help the care economy, because we know foundational to the economy.
Thank you. Bukta, how about you?
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Emily, for inviting me. And it's great to see all of you here today. I think similarly to Banu, I would say subsidizing the cost of childcare, supporting women with the tremendous heavy lift of childcare in this last year, and possibly paying for the cost of childcare for the women who've had to be home to care for their kids, as well as childcare outside.
Great. Thank you. And Ryan?
Yeah, thank you. And good morning, everyone. Maybe to state the obvious, I would say that Seattle's economy cannot be inclusive unless the industries that are driving the economy are inclusive. So what I would do is work to massively diversify the tech industry, and that would mean scaling some of the really high quality initiatives that already exist in this region, like Year Up and Apprenti and Native Developer Academy and others.
Great. Thank you all very much for your answers. You know, prior to COVID-19, we were actually moving in the right direction, albeit a little slowly. So between January 2015 and December 2019, the number of women in senior VP positions increased from 23 to 28%, and in the C-suite from 17 to 21%. But women are still drastically underrepresented, especially women of color. But from 2015 to 2019, a slightly higher percentage of men were actually leaving the workplace than women. But over the last year, we have wiped out decades of progress toward gender equality in the workplace, as the women's labor force participation sits at a 30-year low. According to the U.S. Department, over 2.5 million working women, mostly minorities and mothers, have been either let go, fired, or have resigned since last March, compared to 1.8 million men. And to be clear, it's not okay that 1.8 million men lost their jobs. That is also too much. But today's discussion is all around the disparities that women face and how by addressing them, we will create better working conditions for all people. So let's rewind to March 11th, 2020, the day that changed everything. It's the day that the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a global pandemic. And many women in the United States were forced to make near impossible choices as childcare centers and schools and nearly the entire hospitality industry shut down. Ryan, can you explain what has happened since last March?
Yeah, I will. I'll certainly try. And I think you captured the key trends in your intro there. I remember very vividly last March, because on a Friday, I was in San Diego with a group of economic development CEOs from across the country. We were blissfully unaware of COVID. We were drinking beers on a sunny patio at the end of a conference. And by Monday morning, everyone was back home and had basically set up war rooms to deal with what was clearly quickly becoming an economic catastrophe. So there was a very, very sudden recognition, of course, at every level, federal, state, local, that this was going to be a catastrophe that needed to be dealt with. And immediately following that recognition was the recognition that there was going to be a huge federal response in the form of the CARES Act. And so smart regions began to organize themselves immediately after March 11th. And I want to point out that I'm kind of using the term region deliberately here. There's a lot of discussion about the federal government, which decides how much money to spend. That money goes to states and counties, and cities, and they get to decide how to spend it. But the economy is really fundamentally a regional thing. It doesn't operate at a city scale or a county scale. People's experience of the economy and their access to opportunity depends on what's happening within regions. So here that would be Pierce, King, Snohomish County, the entire metro area. So regions began to really pull together leaders from across different geographies and sectors and began to strategize how they were going to deal with catastrophe. And I think the places that were really smart recognized that COVID, of course, is a crisis in its own right, but maybe more importantly, COVID revealed that there was already a crisis in our economy, right? We had 2.8, 2.9% unemployment the day that COVID hit, and a lot of people felt really good about the economy, and there was reason to feel good. But what we saw immediately, and what many of us already knew, that women and people of color, even if they had jobs, were in really vulnerable positions. And so I think places that were smart recognized that COVID recovery did not just mean picking up the pieces and putting them back how they were. It meant really confronting those underlying challenges and thinking about how are we going to remake the economy in a much more fundamental way after this. So I think between last March and today, what you've seen is that pretty much every city and region across the country has more or less been doing the same things, because the challenge was the same everywhere, which was getting small businesses shored up, getting people back to work as much as possible, and so forth. But I think today we're sort of at the beginning of a new phase where vaccines are coming, the next round of federal money is coming, another round is coming after that. From here on, I think you're going to see differences emerging in really big ways between regions that busied themselves kind of putting the pieces back how they were versus regions that really got thoughtful and kind of tried to respond to these deeper challenges. So let me put that in context in the greater Seattle context. Here, around last March, this region did begin to organize itself in the smart way that I described. And now there's a recovery task force of almost 250 people from across the region. They recognize that this is a transformative moment. They recognize that we really need a strategy and to be really thoughtful about how we respond to this. And so this group followed the data to understand what the underlying challenges were, and basically arrived at the following 4 key data points that are organizing the recovery work here in this region. So the first of those 4 data points is that before COVID in Greater Seattle, 13% of working age adults were out of work, and women and people of color were overrepresented in that 13%. Secondly, before COVID, 35% of people who had jobs in Greater Seattle were in low-wage jobs, barely treading water, if that. So doing the math in your head, those first 2 data points suggest that 49% of Greater Seattle's workforce was struggling before COVID hit. That's a really astounding number in a region like this that has grown so incredibly. Almost half people were basically on the margins, super vulnerable. But that only captures actually part of the problem. 2 other data points. One is that 39% of women of color with a 4-year degree in Greater Seattle had a good job prior to COVID. So that's $25 an hour in benefits. 39% of women of color with a 4-year degree had one of those jobs. That's a problem nationally, but Greater Seattle actually lags other similar metro areas on the West Coast elsewhere on that count. So there really is something distinct there about Greater Seattle's economy. And then the 4th data point that this group is really organized around is that there are 12,000 fewer businesses in Greater Seattle than would be if gender were not a factor in business ownership. So if business ownership equaled the gender demographics of the workforce, there'd be 12,000 more women-owned businesses. And about 3,500 of those would likely be, high growth businesses, the next Amazon or whatever. So this group has really organized around those 4 data points that suggest, again, that what COVID did is it revealed those pre-existing weaknesses, and Greater Seattle is beginning to build a set of strategies around those 4 data points that are focused on creating more good jobs, preparing people for those jobs, changing the way that businesses operate, and improving access to jobs through things like childcare, as Bukta mentioned. So I think that's sort of a blueprint for what's happening, at least in the most forward-looking regions across the country. And I know we'll get a chance to talk later about why it matters so much that we're really attacking these problems with an explicit focus on women and people of color.
Great. Thank you so much, Ryan, for that fantastic overview and just helping prepare us for today's conversation. Banu, let's turn it over to you. Can you explain, how is the economy gendered?
Yeah, thank you, Emily. As an academic, I like to define my terms. So even though we work and live and breathe the economy, I think it helps to kind of just be on the same page and understanding, well, what is the economy exactly? And I'm going to borrow a definition from most economists, which talk about it as the production, distribution and trade and consumption of goods and services. So it's about the management, use, and distribution of resources that we have, both natural and other. So within this context, we need a mechanism for people to engage in different activities for us to function as a society, and the economy is built upon lots of different social relations. I'm going to talk about 3 ways that I think the economy, so all these activities are gendered, in the sense that women are doing particular types of activities when we look at the economy through this concept. One, doing a lot of the invisible work or non-waged work that we associated with reproductive and care economy work. So these are things that women do that are non-paid, they're non-waged, and they're largely invisible, except the pandemic really allowed us to focus on how this kind of work is foundational for quote unquote, the formal economy or the economy where people actually get paid for their labor to be possible. So that's one way, the invisible and non-waged work that women engage in, largely in the facets of reproduction and care. Second, when we look at the formal economy, we see women across the globe in general, with some exceptions, generally distributed in much more lower waged work, or occupations that tend to pay lower in terms of what they're doing. So we tend to call that occupational segregation, where women and across intersectional differences tend to be populating those sectors that are not only low wage, but also precarious, temporary, and often in working conditions that are not safe. Right. And then the third way the economy is gendered, when we look again to the formal economy across the spectrum, there tends to be a continued and persistent gender gap in both wages and compensation, but also leadership and decision-making opportunities. So the structures around the governance of how we make decisions related to the organization of work tends to be gendered. So when you sort of bring that all together, you recognize that policies and practices need to understand the context in which they're trying to make a difference, and that while you can do something here and there, we need real systemic approaches to underscore ways that we can understand the gendering of the economy, but also work to undo it in a way that's equitable.
Thank you very much, Banu. So next question is, why does all of this matter? Why does it matter that women have been more vulnerable in the pandemic, and what happens if we do not address these issues moving forward? Bukta, can you start us off?
Yeah, I have so many more thoughts than when we started out a few minutes ago. But as Ryan and Banu are speaking, it's connecting to so many other things for me. I think that, as Ryan said, a year and a half ago, we were feeling good about the economy. And back then, a year and a half ago, 1 out of every 9 persons in the city of Seattle lived below poverty lines. And so we felt good about the increasing wealth, about the concentration of wealth, good jobs, high salaries in the city of Seattle. And we were okay with leaving a lot of people behind. And I think that, we have come to use the term BIPOC, for example. And I just want to explain for me why that is so important, this term, just the use of it. Because when you look in King County at metrics, no matter what you look at, for example, education, housing, access to quality healthcare, no matter what you look at, we've left Black and Indigenous people behind, way behind for a long, long time. And so we've taken pride, we felt good about the beautiful things that are happening, the value of our homes increasing, and good jobs, and a lot of people moving to our region. But we have lost sight of some of the things that are most important. And I think that Ryan's point about we entered this pandemic, multiple pandemics and crises of the last year and a half with all of these inequities. And the pandemic really exacerbated all of these issues. So the increased number of people who are houseless, and people who are stressed, and I think when it comes to women, we are dealing with multiple issues here. The intersection of sexism and misogyny with racism has impacted the status of women for a long time, right? I just want to use myself as an example and say that I have a master's degree. I have a lot of experience leading nonprofit organizations in the social justice field. But when I decided to have kids, I was a single mom. I raised 2 kids on my own. And for all of these years, I had to wait. I had to wait for a position like the one I have, being a senior director at the Port of Seattle and being a very big leadership position. I felt like I had to wait until my kids were older, that I couldn't take on a job like that. And so I stayed with small grassroots nonprofits, still in leadership positions, worked really hard, raised 2 kids alone. And so I think, you know, your question, Emily, about what, if we did nothing, I think we would face even greater problems coming out of this pandemic. All of the problems have continued to become more and more complex. And women who've been, you know, the industries where women are working, like hospitality, food, the beauty salons and business, have been hit so hard. And women have really been carrying a huge burden of the last year and a half. So I think we entered this with inequities, and the inequities are greater, and we would continue to not center the people who need us to solve these problems the most.
Thank you, Bukta. And Ryan, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Bukta's exactly right, that there is often a discussion that this region's economy has grown and will continue to grow, and it is an unfortunate and important downside that there's this growing inequity and that people are left behind, people are marginalized. I think, however, the reason why this all matters is because arguably already, but certainly soon, these 2 things are going to start impacting one another. In other words, inclusion and inequity is going to start limiting the growth potential of this economy. So if you're someone who cares about growth and prosperity and job creation and rising wages, right? The organizations that I work with that are economic development agencies, that's what they care about. Racism, sexism are huge limiters on that type of growth. So let me zoom out. I liked how Banu put it. Sometimes it's helpful to talk about what the economy actually is, because sort of take it for granted. And Banu's definition was much better than mine that I'm about to use. But you can sort of think about the economy as like the interaction between people and computers and machines and land, right? There's like this bundle of inputs that sort of acts. Here's a really important statistic, though. If you take land as one part of the economy, right? All of the urban land in this entire country is worth about $25 trillion. I don't know how they do it, but economists have estimated that the value of human knowledge, talent in this country is about $240 trillion. So our collective knowledge, our collective skills is worth 10 times as much as all of the urban land in this entire country. So the implication of that is that an economy that is wasting even 1%, much less 5% or 10% of its talent, is hugely underperforming. And I think Bukta's story was perfect, right? There was a multi-year period of Bukta's professional life where she was sort of waiting. When you multiply that across thousands and thousands and thousands of people, that is a huge waste of talent, to sort of put it bluntly. And I think that if you peel back a few layers on the data here in Greater Seattle, you see how this is already impacting growth. And we've had Amazon and Microsoft and all of these things buoying this regional economy. But one important data point that I've been highlighting is that this region is not doing a great job at creating and growing small businesses. So places like Denver and Austin, who we might not quite consider our peers, they're sort of one rung below us, they are massively outperforming Greater Seattle in terms of their creation and job creation within small businesses. That's a threat. And it just so happens that Denver and Austin are doing a much better job than Greater Seattle is in terms of unleashing the entrepreneurial talents of their women and people of color. Similarly, there's more and more discussion about how companies are recognizing the competitive edges of being more diverse. And there's a recent Wall Street Journal article talking about how McKinsey research suggests that more and more companies are going to start moving to or expanding in places like Atlanta, not because of tax incentives and all the things that are typically associated with business relocations, but because Atlanta has an incredible wealth of Black talent coming out of Georgia Tech and HBCUs and so forth. So this economy has been doing well. You can sort of think about exclusion as a separate issue, but really more and more, there's no way to sort of continue to generate growth without dealing with the fact that so much talent in this economy is not being put to good use. So for people who themselves as stewards of the economy and business leaders and so forth, I think that's one way to describe why this matters so much.
Those are really interesting points, Ryan. Before we turn it over to Banu, Trisha from CI30 had a question that I think we should try and answer now rather than waiting till Q&A. But Trisha was asking if you have any data regarding your statistic about who has a good job pre-COVID. You had the statistic for women, but do you have any to compare it to for like white women or men of color or white men?
Yes. So it's probably not going to be a surprise that the order goes as follows. And I actually have the data here, and I'm gonna quote it just to be safe. So in Greater Seattle prior to COVID, if you look at the group of people who had four-year college degrees, over 66% of white men ended up in a good job. 54% of Hispanic men, 50% of Black men. So it's all men, with disparities by race. And then it's 40% of white women, and then 39% of Black and Hispanic women. So the range in Greater Seattle, again, among people with a four-year degree, is from 39% up to 66%. So it is a huge disparity within Greater Seattle. But as I believe I mentioned, you can also look across cities within any of these categories and see differences. So we should not celebrate the fact that, say, San Diego, 55% Black and Hispanic women with a college degree ended up with a good job. Obviously, that is not a success, but that 55% that you see in a Tampa or a San Diego and some other regions really puts the 39% here in Greater Seattle into context. And one other quick data point on that, my colleagues at Brookings, Amy Liu and Renaya Dinkins, just put out a report that showed that Greater Seattle is in the bottom third of large metro areas in terms of the representation of people of color in the tech industry and in management jobs. So obviously these two statistics are linked.
Thank you for sharing all of that. And going back to, why all of this matters, Banu, do you want to add your thoughts?
I will thoughts, but mostly I'll add data as to why it matters, borrowing from various different work that's been done by the McKinsey Global Institute, the World Bank, OECD, IMF, and UNESCO. So if we close the gender gap in the workforce globally, we'd add about $28 trillion to the global GDP. So by 2025. In North America, this would be 5.7 trillion. And depending on the region, that number kind of fluctuates. But in aggregate, it would be $28 trillion in terms of global GDP growth. And this is assuming gender parity, which is that women are able to participate in the labor force at the same rates as men, and that they are able to work as many hours as men, and that they are employed at the same levels as men across the different sectors of the economy. What's really interesting is that despite the overall economic benefits of participation, there still remains significant legal, structural, and cultural obstacles. Some more stats to help us understand that. Right now, about 59 countries still have no laws that prohibit sexual harassment in the workplace. Women, on average, spend 300% more time in unpaid care work compared to men. About 2/3 of the world's 750 illiterate adults are women, and there are about 190 million fewer women than men who have a bank account. So when you sort of look at these issues and you look at sort of, one, the economic benefits of gender parity, but two, sort of the consequences of living with inequities for supposed democracies of the world, I think we really see injustice continue, particularly across gender, but also race, class, caste, and other sort of ways in which we differentiate each other in society. Not only are we leaving money at the table, but we also know that in regions where these inequities grow, there's increased violence, conflict, war, and the cost of rebuilding societies is monumental, and it takes a long time. So I think it behooves us to be able to understand these inequities and to know that there are very concrete things we can do to address them, because at the end, everybody wins, right? Economies win, society wins, families and organizations, everyone comes out better.
Okay, so speaking of recovery, and by the way, those are staggering statistics, and this is why I love data. You can't argue with data, or at least you shouldn't. Data should eliminate the drama and tell you what to focus on. So when it does come to an inclusive recovery, what does this look like? Let's talk about both policy, the local level, the global scale, and I'll let you all fight over who wants to start off this part of the conversation.
Well, I might jump in just because I want to build on one of the very last point actually that Banu made, which is that everybody wins when we make progress on gender and racial equity. So this is true at every level that you imagine, but I think it's important to emphasize that that is true all the way down to the level of individual businesses. And I know Bukta will talk more about this, but there is more and more really good research coming out of the very concrete impacts of increasing diversity at the business level, improving the quality of jobs at the business level. So we know that businesses with more diverse management teams are more innovative, and it's not hard to figure out why that would be, right? When you have more perspectives involved in designing products and services, you're more likely to be on top of the latest consumer trends, and that's reflected very clearly in the data. If companies improve the quality of jobs, so get really thoughtful about what are these low-wage occupations in which women are overrepresented, and what can we do to raise the wages, provide more supports, et cetera. Time and again, you see companies that make those investments in their kind of frontline or low-wage workers see more productivity, lower turnover, and you can assign a dollar value to all of those things. And in almost every case, making those investments pays for itself. So again, at every level, these win-win opportunities. So in light of that, what does an inclusive recovery look like? I think two things at the sort of city or regional level. One is, as we've clearly demonstrated today, we have so much data at our fingertips these days. And what I see is that a lot of regions use that wealth of data to kind of just throw 100 metrics up and say everything is a priority. And if you do that, then it is a priority. So I think an inclusive recovery has to start with metrics that are very specific and very specifically focused on gender equity and racial equity. And they have to be specific at multiple levels of the economy. So we know that there's disparities in who's out of work, but as we just talked about, we know that there's also disparities in terms of the management ranks of the tech economy. And so at each level, we need metrics that say going from here to there would create an inclusive economy. So that's the starting point. And then on top of that, I think we need to build systems that do 4 things that I mentioned earlier. First of all, we need to create better jobs. And a lot of that could be, as I just mentioned, upgrading the quality of jobs that exist, which pays for itself. We need bigger, better, more aligned talent development systems that connect people to those good jobs. We need to increase access to jobs, and we need to change the way that businesses operate. And I'll just go a tiny bit deeper on that last point. Working at the regional level is interesting because regions are not things that can influence policy, right? As I said, like the federal government makes policy decisions, county governments react. Regions are like networks. They're sort of informal ecosystems of public, private, nonprofit, community organizations that ideally work together towards a given goal. And I think one thing that we can do and are increasingly doing is pushing companies who have made race and gender equity commitments to actually act upon those. So we in this region have many companies that, and so other regions as well, and economic development organizations and their partners can pull these companies together and say, great, you've made these commitments. We will commit to providing you the services and tools and systems that you need to live up to those, but we're going to hold you accountable. We're going to track your metrics, right? And the reason that we're doing this and we expect you to be involved is because not only have you made these public commitments, but this is good for your own bottom line. But it really does take organizing companies to begin to change their behavior for any of these other kind of systems to operate as they should.
Thank you, Ryan. And Bukta?
I'll go next. Yeah. So, I really agree that data is so important. Disaggregated data is the first step in the process of addressing racial equity. And it isn't as if we haven't had access to this information for years and years, right? And it's not as if we don't know that kids of color are left behind in our school systems, or women of color are left behind. So how do we center justice and equity in moving forward? First, I think we have to understand that equal and equity are very, very different things, right? So giving everyone the same thing is not going to work. So I don't know how many people here are familiar with the concept of targeted universalism, but that's basically what Ryan is talking about. So we have to target the people who are left far behind and design systems and solutions that work for them. And as a community, commit to we-ness instead of me-ness. And that we-ness builds a vision that if we support the people who are left behind, we will all do better. So at the Port of Seattle, we came up with 5 principles that I want to just talk about for a second to hold in building our recovery effort that would define for us what this phenomenon that I've just talked about is, how do we translate this? The first of those is that we center anti-racist practices and principles. That's the first step. And I would say specifically, really looking at uprooting anti-Black racism. Because again, that we see in King County, Washington State, that Black and Indigenous people are left really far behind. If we look at uprooting anti-Black racism as a first step. The second one is centering the needs of the people who are most impacted. So this concept of targeted universalism. If we engage people who've been left behind, not continue to develop solutions for them without their input, without their engagement at the table, really, you all know the saying, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. So we want to really make sure to really build a bigger table, have women of color at the table, have people who are left behind, helping to design solutions. Third is ensuring language and cultural competence. We've been talking about this for a long time. And we've seen, for example, in the first round of the CARES Act, how challenging it was for businesses owned by immigrants to understand the benefits, to access the benefits, and what happened by the time they could access it, dollars were out. Fourth step is to support BIPOC-led community-based organizations that are rooted in the community, centered by the community, led by the community, and trust their knowledge. Fifth is to really direct our resources as much as possible to the communities that are most impacted. And quickly, I want to share with you that at the port, we've built an equity index built on 25 indicators that for the port define what equity looks like. And that's primarily environmental justice, economic justice, and the impact of the port. So we look at the communities of King County against this index, and also look at where the port's investments are currently, and look at the gaps to be able to direct our investments for the future.
Wonderful. So the plan is to start Q&A in a few minutes, but before we get to questions, I have a couple final questions that I'd like to ask you, and these can be shorter answers, but some takeaways for our audience today. So first of all, for anyone that's tuning in today that really wants to do one thing right now to help close the COVID-19 gender gap, what would you recommend? And feel free to just jump in.
Oh, can I start, Emily? So
Please.
Particularly those of you in organizations, there are so many, I would say, tools that you could use, but one really great one is from the UN Women and Office of Global Compact, is a women's empowerment principle tool that you can use to help you do a gender gap analysis in your organization, where you look at your workplace, marketplace, and your community to identify gender gaps as they relate to your policies, your implementation, your measurements, and your transparency. And this is a tool that literally has boxes you can check to help guide your thinking and action. And it's freely available. I'm happy to share with you, Emily, as well, for folks to get access to this and start the work today.
Thank you. And we will send out a follow-up email that includes some of the data that we talked about. Arden, I know you asked Ryan could share those statistics, so we'll include that in the email, the tool that Banu is talking about as well. Bukta, Ryan?
Yeah, I would say the one thing that's not going to do it is hiring a diversity consultant or one person who does equity work in your organization. We see on LinkedIn that chief equity officers are right now the most popular, most in-demand positions around the country. And so we know that everybody's waking up and is alert to this. That's beautiful, but that one position is not going to do it. It's an absolute commitment at the top to long-term sustainable efforts to address these inequities. And I totally agree with Banu that doing an assessment, which we're really engaged in right now at the port, is one of the first steps that is really critical to do.
Great. And Ryan?
Yeah, I'll just quickly pile a little bit, especially to Banu's point. I mean, I talked to someone recently in this region who runs basically a tech training program for the exact type of people that we've been talking about in this population. And they have about 1,500 people ready to go who have passed all the tests and are essentially in a sort of a waiting room, ready to be connected to the incredible jobs that exist in this region. And the only thing preventing from having incredible jobs tomorrow is the fact that companies are not at the table quite ready to change how they hire, quite ready to rethink what credentials they prize or how they do interviews or whatever it might be. So these kind of company by company changes, operations and culture are hugely important. And I think that there can be kind of a contagious effect. If a few companies start being really thoughtful, others are going to notice, and that can kind of spread throughout the region. So pushing for those operational changes within companies as far as hiring and pay and promotion and so forth is really important.
Speaking of that, you might have seen that LinkedIn just announced that it will release some new features in the coming months. So among them, allowing parents to add stay-at-home mom or dad titles to their resume and have more options to describe any gaps in their careers due to parenting. So hopefully that helps eliminate the stigmas around gaps in between jobs, and it helps normalize the conversation when it comes to that. So final question for you before we head to Q&A. If there's one thing that you want everyone to remember as a result of our conversation here today, what would it be? One thing.
I would just say that the one thing to remember is that this economy is nowhere near its potential, right? We're going to have a fast bounce back. GDP is going to get going again. Estimates are that unemployment's going to be around 5%, in a matter of months, not years, which is not great, but it's a lot better than it was. So people are going to start getting amnesia pretty quickly about what we've talked about today. And I think it's just important to remember and consistently emphasize everywhere we can that we are holding ourselves back. This region should be the most opportunity-rich economy in the country. There's no reason it can't be, and we haven't even come close to that potential yet because we are not unleashing the talents of women and people of color as we should be. So that would be my key takeaway.
Thank you. Bhukta?
These one thing questions make me so nervous because I have a hard time focusing on one thing. But I would say the one thing is that this moment is our opportunity to change and to create a world that's built on justice and equity for all. This is a moment to recognize that different communities have different needs, require different responses, and we have a chance to undo the deep inequities. And it's a good time to roll up our sleeves and lean in and recommit to these efforts. Great.
And Banu?
Yeah, I agree, Bhukta. These one question answer ones also make me nervous. But I would say, if you hear the word gender, don't shy away from it, and to understand that it is an organizing principle of our society and our economy. And it's about something and gender. Gender is generally fundamental to the way we've organized so many things. So I would say, think about the ways in which you see gender functioning in your own life. And where are those areas that you can hold yourself, your organization, and others accountable to take action to move forward? Because we can, each of us, do something.
Great advice. All right, so a couple questions from the audience. Brian, this one will probably be for you, but anyone feel free to chime in. Jay from the Port of Seattle is asking, why do you think women of color with four-year degrees struggle in Seattle? What's going on in our job market, economy, culture, et cetera, that is creating such disparities in Seattle?
That is a great question that I don't have a perfect answer to. I think, obviously, when you think about the greater Seattle economy, there are industries that come to mind. And I think one of the things that's really interesting and about working at, again, the regional level is that's how industries organize themselves, right? Like the tech industry is sort of exists at this regional scale in Seattle. Companies interact with each other, workers move between companies, sort of this, it's an ecosystem, it's a cluster. And so I would think that the most distinct thing about this economy is how strong its tech economy is. And therefore, if there are barriers, either kind of formal, informal, to women and people of color accessing good jobs in the tech economy, then Seattle is, immediately at a huge disadvantage in this regard. And we know that, professional networks really matter. Like there's a lot of studies about the tiny percentage of jobs that are ever actually publicly posted, right? Like people gain opportunity in the economy and move through the economy in all these informal ways through networks, connections. And so if you have barriers to begin with, and there are so few women in management positions or people of color in technical positions, that sort of has these ripple effects where like every one person that you have in a job with decision-making power in these high-wage industries is like another node in that network that's removed, and a whole bunch of potential connections fade away. So I think that like the good news is that if you start making progress, it can quickly start to have kind of exponential impact, right? Because as you get more people into those jobs in those industries, they'll be more likely to be thoughtful in how they hire and reach out to their network. So I think once you get the ball rolling and really focus on this, it can really kind of take off. And that at least is my hope.
Great. Bukta, question for you from Trisha from CI Security. Is there somewhere we can learn more about the Port's Equity Index, and or any advice for organisms who would like to do something similar for their employees and area of impact?
Yes, you can learn more about the Port's index. Our plan is to make it public by June. But in the meanwhile, of course, you can contact me. If you email Emily, she can connect us, or my email, I think, is public on our website. And I think, there's a lot of different ways to begin work in your organization. But in my opinion, building a broad base of support from employees that care is one of the most important things you can do. I think starting an equity committee, a gender equity, racial equity, or even joining the efforts and having people come together to design a plan to start to develop the indicators of what equity should look like for your organization are all of the steps that you start with. And I'm happy to support and help people if they want to reach out.
Great, thank you. And Delmas has a question. Anyone feel free to answer this one. What advice would you give to a company looking for ways to recruit a more diverse workforce? It's a great question.
Yeah, so, I'm sure that Banu and Ryan and I probably have similar vision, but come at it at different angles. I think that advertising broadly, reaching new audiences are some of the things that we already know are the right things to do, but they're not enough. I think for example, Port, so many of the careers at the Port are so specific and have been historically dominated by men and white men. And so it's about starting much earlier with young people, middle schools, increasing awareness. And in my mind, I connect the dots between if so many of our young people are not interested in going, for example, only through four-year college track. We know that many of the Port careers can, with a two-year degree, with training, with apprenticeships, can qualify you for these jobs that make a very decent living. So how do we increase information and awareness early on for young people about options they have, and increase access to these jobs and understanding of the option, the choices before them. So I think those are really the important things to do.
And just to add to that and elaborate on what Bukta said, I think there has to be an understanding of whether in your organization there's a shared sense of understanding that DEI is something you want to address, and then whether there's a shared sense of urgency around it and support from leadership and funding for it. Because it can't be the onus, as Bukta mentioned, of one person in one section of the organization whose remit isn't wide or whose organizational authority cannot allow to make the changes that are going to have to take place across all facets of your organization. And again, I'm happy to share that tool that I mentioned to provide a framework that as an organization you have to make your own to see what's going to be feasible and possible for you.
Okay, and Oh, Ryan, did you want to add
just
something?
one quick anecdote that I often use. My wife works for a software company that's based in Toronto. They grew from 80 to 120 employees a year. By the way, that is like the engine of any regional economy, is companies that are doing that. They grew 40 employees in a year with one HR staff. So if you think about a region like this, there are software companies and other companies all over the place adding 10, 20, 30, 40 employees a year with maybe one HR person. And so there are some really interesting models emerging in other regions where basically like economic development organizations that maybe only used to help companies with innovation or manufacturing process improvement are now realizing like we can help groups of companies get more sophisticated and have more capacity when it comes to HR. And so that's just another thing, is I think that question came from the Port of Seattle, where you have really smart people like Bukta helping, but the economy grows when tons of small and medium-sized companies grow, and we have to find ways to bundle those companies and help them be thoughtful in this way. We can't just rely on Microsoft, Amazon, Port, Boeing, right? So that's just another important angle.
Okay. And final questions. We have 2 questions. Let's try and tackle Hector's. How can we create touch points in our organizations to empower women to stay and have a successful career? I'll jump in on this one. So I just read some research around this, but a 2020 Women in the Workplace study found women are feeling more burnt out and under pressure than men are. So doing something as simple as just addressing that and having companies adjust expectations that lead to those feelings. And also, as we talked about earlier in the conversation, maybe universal paid family medical leave or universal child care, things like that just help alleviate stress.
I would just add that, as I mentioned, we're currently looking at a disaggregated data and doing an assessment about the position of women of color at the port. And, we can see that, for example, Dawn Hunter, the incredible, amazing leader who just spoke, is the 4th Black woman ever to be in a director position at the port. So how do we create the vision for an organization can continue to welcome women of color and continue to advance women of color? I think there's a lot of complex solutions. But Dawn, for example, let's use Dawn or myself, we need to have supportive supervisors to help develop plans for our advancement and support our advancement. We need to have organizational policies that welcomes us to the table, brings our voices, includes us in solutions at the table. We need to have an organization that has policies that protects us against harassments and takes action. So there's a lot that goes into what does it take to be a welcoming organization that has a culture of belonging for women and people of color. And those organizations are places where people want to stay. They want to continue to contribute to the bigger picture and to their own success.
Hey, on that note, it's 9:30, so we know some people have to leave. Sandra asked an amazing question, which I'm going to read it, and then this will be kind of a teaser, and hopefully it'll encourage you to join our networking portion after, where we can answer this question. But Sandra had asked, as we looked into the meaning of the economy, how do you see diversity now and today? How can we draw clearly the relationship between increased diversity and engagement in business, creativity, and growth? So it's a big question. So
Wow.
Think about that. And anyone who can stay behind, we are going to end this session and then head over to the social lounge. So hopefully you can join us there. Bukta, Banu, Ryan, thank you so much for sharing all of your, not just thoughts, but all of your data and statistics with us. And thank you to everyone who attended. We will send out a follow-up email with the information that we talked about. And again, hopefully we'll see you in the social lounge.
Thank you.
Thanks.